There Might Be Hope, Chapter 1, Dust to Dust. The Mediterranean glistens as local fishing vessels weighed down with their fresh morning catches coast in towards land on translucent waves of cobalt and turquoise. Their destination is the magnificent, nearly circular harbor guarded by a towering 11-story limestone lighthouse. Massive quarried stone docks line the harbor perimeter, marrying the sea with a stately columned portico. Adjoining storehouses overflow with sacks of wheat and sealed earthen amphora, heavy with olive oil and wine. Provincial slaves labor shoulder to shoulder with African freemen, loading heavier, seaworthy vessels capable of freighting between 100 and 600 tons of cargo. Powered by simple cotton sails and the sweat of oarsmen, these ships annually bear some 3 million pounds of olive oil to Rome as tribute in the year of 210 AD. Likely, this tribute was a mere sampling of the total olive oil and assorted agricultural commodities produced by the region and headed to locations throughout the empire. Beyond her cornucopic wharves and warehouses is the Cardo, a central life-giving north-south thoroughfare. This broad limestone street is bordered by colonnades of ornately sculpted marble reliefs depicting both mythological figures and hometown heroes. Detailed and vibrantly colored tile mosaics chime in, boasting of both of the sea's abundance and the land's bounteous cultivated crops. To the west of our harbor lie the standard Roman seaside attractions, a magnificent 3-storied amphitheater overlooking the Mediterranean, a 16,000-seat gladiator arena, and a chariot race course. Nestled amongst them are a plethora of Greek and Roman temples, hedged by multitudes of luxurious villas. Its exact population is debated, but now, at her zenith, the city is home to at least 30,000. At the city's heart lies a flourishing marketplace fashioned from blue and gold-veined marble columns. Here, regional commodities of olive oils, wines, and wheat change hands alongside pastured beef, wild-caught and farm fishes, wild boar, venison, an array of poultry, including ducks and geese, fattened for foie gras. Fresh, local, and inherently organic produce accompany these staples by season and boast dozens of varieties of pears, apples, peaches, nectarines, sweet cherries, watermelon, pomegranates, peas, turnips, and kale, along with onions, beans, and lentils. Meat may be a luxury for the wealthy, but the sheer abundance of fruits and vegetables enables even the poorest to afford their fill of them. To the city's west and northwest lie its literal bread and butter, its farmland. Long before Roman rule, farming flourished in this area, but under it, agriculture intensified and boomed. Forests and grasslands, whose roots stretched down into rich, dark soils, once dominated the landscape here, but were slowly broken up by intensive agriculture beginning around 1 BC. Now, in 210 AD, farms blanket the countryside. Olive groves dominate the hillsides, while valleys cradle grain, vegetable crops, and grazing pastures for cattle. Modern agriculturists and researchers debate how much a single olive tree produced in Roman times, but they agree that a number of between 66 and 220 pounds of olive oil per tree is likely. Pliny, though, called these trees millennia, expecting them to annually produce around 720 pounds or 1,000 libra of olives each, a figure comparable with modern high yielding producers, notably without modern methods. Despite their immense yearly tribute in olive oil, according to Pliny, the area was best known for its cereal production. Wheat production made our city, Leptis Magna, and many similar Roman agricultural colonies economic powerhouses and fueled Rome and her endless military campaigns. Military strategy, prowess, and personality frequently steal the spotlight from the quiet foundation undergirding every successful campaign, a reliable food supply. Apart from the collective agricultural strength of colonies like Leptis, the Roman Empire could not and would not have existed. The Romans begged, borrowed, and stole much of their agricultural acumen from preceding and surrounding cultures. Legume cover crops, manure fertilizers, crop rotations, fallowing fields, and diversified farming complemented technologies such as remarkable iron wheel plows, irrigation systems, ox-drawn harvesters, and even greenhouses. This collective knowledge and practice outproduced both previous known farming generations as well as those to come for millennia. Vineyards, grain fields, and olive groves produced robust yields that would not begin to be met nor rivaled until the Green Revolution of the 1950s, nearly 2,000 years later. By way of the Mississippi River, it's 102 miles from the Gulf of Mexico to the port of New Orleans. Broad blue skies frame the glassy, shimmering, olive-green ship channel that begins at the Mississippi Delta's southwest pass. For nearly 200 years, ship captains have depended upon a successive series of lighthouses to guide them and their valuable cargo into the pass. The eldest of these is an 1839 vintage, whitewashed brick tower that, despite gradually sinking since its inception, still stands today. Within its site watches its successor. This 13-story, cast iron, concrete, and timber fortress was a cutting-edge feat of late 19th century engineering. The third and final manned lighthouse is no more. Constructed in the 1960s with all the bells and whistles of a contemporary offshore oil rig, including living quarters and a helicopter pad, it fell to Hurricane Katrina's brutality in 2005. Today, an unmanned skeletal tower, minimally adorned with solar panels and an electric flashing light, alerts ships to the pass entrance. Though barely taller than the lighthouse at Leptis Magna, it beacons immense welded steel ships freighting between 60,000 and 100,000 tons of cargo. These behemoths form a nearly contiguous stern-to-bow parade up the Mississippi, delivering in refrigerated reefers vegetables from Mexico, Canada, and China. Fruits and coffees arrive from Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Chile. Bulk cargo ships laden with rice and soybeans hail from Thailand, India, Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru. Inbound to New Orleans they pass, often less than a ship's width apart from their predecessors, which have been unloaded and refilled, and are now bound for China, Mexico, Colombia, Germany, and Egypt, carrying rice, soybeans, and corn. Navigating upriver from the pass to the port of New Orleans requires the better part of a day's journey and the onboarding of a skilled Louisiana River pilot with keen understanding of the ever-rolling and shifting sands below the river's smooth surface to keep the ships from running aground. With the careful maneuvering of a tug, ships parallel park alongside the New Orleans dock, and Microsoft Blue gantry cranes roll down rails to position themselves for unloading. Perpendicular to the ship, gantry crane operators hover within tiny glass pods some 13 stories up and mechanically hoist mustard yellow, rusty red, burnt orange, navy, and gray containers from the merchant vessels onto awaiting trucks and rail cars bound for distribution centers and ultimately retailers further inland. Just to the north and east of the port, concrete, steel, and glass skyscrapers reaching 50 floors tall watch over the port of New Orleans and are hedged by welcoming neighborhoods of red brick, cast iron, and vibrantly painted historic homes. Trolleys sew commercial and residential districts together with riverside attractions like the Mercedes-Benz Superdome, St. Louis Cathedral, and Audubon Park. Throughout the city come the warm, beckoning aromas of rich, dark, simmering roux. Fresh bell peppers, onions, and celery are slowly stewed with tender Gulf crabs and oysters and thickened with flour and butter to create hearty jambalayas and spicy gumbos. Fresh cornbread battered shrimp are fried, wrapped in warm French bread and soaked in remoulade sauce. Pillowy beignets are showered in sweet powdered sugar and accompanied with rich, hot coffee. These foods are the lifeblood of New Orleans' nearly 400,000 citizens. The Amazon-acquired chain, Whole Foods, helps to supply the ingredients. Perhaps the most widely recognizable of New Orleans groceries, Whole Foods originally made its name by purchasing and showcasing fresh, local, and organic produce. Farmers' stories and portraits once were stylishly featured alongside the fruits of their efforts. But statistically today, most of America's food is neither fresh nor local. In spite of a growing local foods movement, U.S. vegetable and grain imports have more than doubled since 1999. In fact, today's typical American meal features ingredients from at least 5 countries outside of the U.S. Most of America's fresh fruits and vegetables have waited anywhere from a few weeks to a year in storage by the time they appear in the supermarket. In the fresh food department, America is more akin to Rome than Leptis Magna. But America still dominates food exportation, and particularly grain exportation. In 2021, almost 60% of the United States grain exports left American soil from the Louisiana port region in reloaded cargo ships bound primarily for China and Mexico, but also Europe, South America, and most certainly Africa. Finding modern-day Leptis Magna, or what remains, means a roughly 2-hour drive southeast of Tripoli, Libya. Eroded hillsides, pockets of bullet-ridden rural villages, and vestiges of a cruder oil industry repetitiously narrate the now seemingly endless centuries of economic desolation and political strife Libyans have endured since the fall of Leptis Magna. The mummified remains of our once great city remain mostly buried under shifting sand dunes. The excavated portions, though, stun and shine in both beauty and complexity of extraordinarily well-preserved stone structures and mosaic artwork. Marble blocks and reclining columns have been strewn about over time from the Grecian-style buildings they once conjoined. The market and the harbor's former glorious and immense stocks of grain Olive oil, wine, and wide varieties of locally grown produce are no more. Libyans now import up to 75% of their food, and 95% of Libya today is desert. The former abundance of Leptis Magna's market must be as difficult for modern Libyans to envision as for former residents of its current desolation. Standing near the crumbling lighthouse foundation as waves pound against its limestone and granite remnants, you may watch an occasional cargo ship or oil tanker powering across the Mediterranean. But today, they dock at other ports. Leptis Magna's harbor no longer brims with seaworthy ships bearing agricultural commodities. Today it brims with silt. So much silt fills the harbor that you can often walk completely across it without getting your shoes wet. And until recently, many archaeologists questioned whether this premier harbor ever functioned. Long-standing theory asserted that the Roman Empire's decline in military power, along with a terrific earthquake in 365 AD, wrought the city's ruin and virtual desertion. A theory both comfortable and acceptable to us living in a technological society. Is this true, though? Would the same theory carry equal viability for a prosperous agrarian economy, where fertile, profitable lands existed to rebuild wealth? Archaeologists from two independent teams have re-examined these ideas and come to some fresh conclusions. Weathered olive press remnants dating back to the Roman era stand like tombstones amidst sandy dunes and mark nearly 50 farm and home sites that once flanked the countryside around Leptis Magna around its peak in 200 AD. Evidence testifies, though, that by the mid-300s, decades prior to the 365 earthquake, nearly half of these settlements had already been abandoned. Like agricultural production across the Roman Empire, Leptis Magna's agricultural boom lasted just around 200 years, from 100 AD to 300 AD. Despite political pressures, why would fertile and productive lands be abandoned in an agrarian economy? How did North Africa become the barren wasteland and desert we see today? Our answer may likely reside in her harbor and a dammed wadi. South and slightly east of Leptis Magna lies the Wadi Lebda, a seasonal freshwater river basin that Romans dammed around 70 AD. The dam stabilized intermittent flows, protected the city from flash floods, and supplied running water to her citizens, their homes, businesses, and public fountains. Leptis Magna's harbor served as a natural outlet of the Wadi Lebda, and married with a second wadi flowing via aqueducts from western farmlands. The Wadi Lebda Dam stands today as it did then. It's 6 meters tall and 200 meters long. Romans built a secondary 5-meter-high exterior barrier wall as a little extra insurance to shield the city should the primary dam give way. But archaeological examination found no evidence of earthquake damage to either structure. In fact, by the 365 earthquake, the dam that had once served as the city's main water supply was itself clearly no longer functional. It was already filled to the brim with silt. Rather than contain water, water would have cascaded over the dam like a waterfall and poured directly into the channel leading to the harbor. Successive layers of the harbor's soil also confirmed that the silt was brought in sequentially via the wadi. Where did the soils come from? They came from the once fertile fields surrounding Leptis Magna. The city wasn't thrown into sudden chaos and destruction by an earthquake. Slowly at first, and then rapidly, the soils that built these farms, that powered the harbor, that fed an empire, quietly failed and washed down the wadis and out into the Mediterranean. Natural disasters or attacks wrought by warring nomadic tribes are frequently blamed for the mysterious abandonment of these ancient cities. Isn't it more likely that these disasters and attacks were merely the final death blow on a civilization already slowly dying from diminishing soil fertility and weakened from malnutrition? Neither glamorous nor historically well understood, soil loss is usually a gradual process. Fields usually fail first in part, then one by one across a farm. As topsoils quietly fail and slip away one by one, farmers are forced to leave their lands as an area plays out. By around 320 AD, Leptis Magna's once fertile farm soils had washed down into the Wadi and out to sea. Slowly and softly, desert sands blew across and began to bury Leptis Magna, leaving the city for future generations to unearth. By the Vandal invasion of 439 AD, little likely remained capable of sustaining either defenders or marauders. By 600 AD, only 2 identifiable outlying farms remained. Thereafter, the area was frequented mostly by nomadic Arabic tribes and later inhabited by subsistence farmers. Leptis Magna isn't the only Roman harbor adjacent to a once intensive farming community that today brims with silt. And it isn't the lone example of soil depletion preceding a culture's economic doom either. Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel were all once historically high-yielding agrarian and even densely forested areas, famous for their oaks, cedars, vineyards, wheat fields, and well-nourished herds of cattle and horses. Today, in many areas, they are overseen by washed-out hills and plateaus and lie buried up to 13 feet deep under erosional debris. If capable of sustaining any agrarian life at all, it is generally limited to sheep and goats, the hardiest and least nutritionally selective of all herd livestock. Long ago, these civilizations ruled the known world until they could no longer feed their inhabitants. Today, these lands are known as deserts, but substantial evidence indicates that they are less desert than desertified. Most Libyans today live huddled on the small remaining sliver of coastline that has not been claimed by the ever-expanding Saharan desert. Romantic images of nomadic Tuareg tribes aboard camels rhythmically striding across rusty sand dunes have become synonymous with the Sahara, but up until 4000 BC, the Sahara was a tropical oasis, filled with massive lakes and rivers. Even as recently as 2,000 years ago, much of the Sahara was still prime cattle country. How the Sahara Desert was born is up for speculation, but soil samples indicate it happened in less than 200 years. What was once a relatively limited desert has expanded exponentially to encompass 8% of our Earth's total land mass, and it's still growing. Leptis Magna may not be in the export business anymore, but the Sahara certainly is. About 400 to 600 million tons of its most easily mobilized remaining asset depart the Sahara annually: soil. The majority of the Sahara, 80%, never made yesteryear's enchanting postcard or today's Instagram feed. Those steeply sloping, iron-rich dunes, tall enough to bury a New Orleans high-rise with sand to spare, only cover about 20% of the Sahara. After 2 millennia of completely exposed soils and severe and persistent winds, most of the Sahara doesn't look like the Sahara anymore. It looks like rocks. Wind-chiseled rock formations, rock piles covering rock mountains, and barren bedrock are the reality of up to 80% of our modern Sahara. Most of the Sahara isn't in the Sahara anymore. A good portion of its sands, though, still continue to reach South and North America, the Caribbean, Europe, the Middle East, and sub-Saharan Africa. Wind might seem like an equal opportunity force, but it isn't. Simple wind physics dictates that the heavier you are, the less likely you are to be carried off by it. Farmland topsoils are no different, and unfortunately, our best soils tend to be our lightweights. Silty loams are among the first to get picked up and spirited away, while coarser and heavier sand granules stay behind. These finer soils, along with organic matter and nutrients, are easily snatched up thousands of feet into the atmosphere and carried for thousands of miles more to be deposited, hopefully, onto other continents, but more frequently into the ocean. Coarser, heavier sands either stay behind or generally travel respectively shorter distances, bouncing along the ground. The result is that wind erosion causes even once prime farmland over time to become coarser and coarser, sandier and sandier, as farms inch closer and closer to bedrock. Under the most idyllic climate conditions, forming a single inch of new soil takes 30 to 200 years. In semi-arid or desert areas, such as Leptis Magna, 1 inch of topsoil formation may take thousands of years, or even fail completely. Farming, since its inception, seems to have always inherently produced some level of erosion. Because soil formation is so slow, even low erosion rates are dangerous and unsustainable over the long haul. Losing any more than 2 tons of topsoil per year per acre is considered an irrecoverable loss. Lose a steady 5 tons per acre per year, and you'll have lost 6 inches of topsoil per acre in about 200 years. Most topsoil is only 6 inches deep. That also happens to be the current average erosion rate for farms across the U.S. If we were just beginning to farm in the U.S., we might not be so concerned. But Americans aren't newbie farmers. We're veterans on the back end of that 200 years of loss. From the 1950s until recently, annual erosion has been well more than twice the current rate. In many parts of the U.S., losing 10 tons per acre per year of farmland or more is still the norm. Conservatively, you might deduce that we have 60 years of farmland topsoil left in the U.S., but realistically, we have 30. That's it. 30 years of U.S. farmland soils remain. This is an average. More intensively farmed lands, such as the Plain States, from North Dakota to Texas, will likely be the first to hit bedrock, followed by the West Coast. Once initiated, erosion typically begets more erosion, and if left unchecked, erosion begets desertification. Desertification begets more desertification. To say that we're losing an average of 5 tons per acre per year of topsoil on farms across the U.S. is an estimate, and honestly, a conservative one. The reason? Measuring wind erosion with 100% accuracy is virtually impossible, and we generally err on the low side. Imagine if you live a half mile away from your nearest neighbor. After a rainstorm, you compare notes and learn that while the rain gauge at your house measured 1 inch of rain, your neighbor received 3 inches. It seems logical to estimate that the crops midway between your two houses received 2 inches of rain, but unless you had a rain gauge there, you wouldn't know for sure. Maybe the most intense parts of the storm passed between your houses, and that area received 3.5 inches of rain. Maybe it only received a half an inch of rain. Measuring erosion is similar. The USDA measures soils leaving farms annually through small sample plots of farmland under varying conditions, but inevitably the total amount of eroded farm soils in our rivers, like the Mississippi, is considerably greater than our predictions based on these test plots say it ought to be. It has been said that to understand the enormity of this problem, one need only stand at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers in Cairo, Illinois, and watch as thick mocha latte and army drab colored waters swirl together in liquid form. Smooth surfaces belie the powerful current that daily sweeps hundreds of thousands of tons of once fertile topsoil downriver towards New Orleans. An average of 436,000 tons of soil daily floats suspended within the waters of the Mississippi. This is only suspended sediment. That's the equivalent of 14 statues of liberty floating down the Mississippi daily. In living terms, that's the equivalent of about 600,000 cows floating down the Mississippi every day. Beneath the river's surface, heavier farm soils roll and buck along the riverbed, heading downstream with the current. Altogether, the Mississippi carries about 500 million tons of farmer U.S. farmland soil into the Gulf of Mexico each year. That's about as much soil as the Sahara loses every year. By the square mile, the entire continental United States could easily fit inside the Sahara with some room to spare. The immense volume of Mississippi River erosion is predominantly from the U.S. plain states. Actually, though, the scariest part of these statistics isn't the sheer volume of farmable soil being lost, or even that the numbers are increasing. It's that they aren't. The volumes are actually decreasing. Mississippi soil erosion peaked in the 1950s and 60s, and every subsequent decade has seen a gradual decline. We like to think better farming practices have slowed the soil exodus, and to some degree they have. The reality, though, is that we're running out of farmland topsoils to erode. The bulk of our prime Midwestern and Plains topsoil left decades ago. Upriver from Cairo and just north of the Missouri River lies Divide County, North Dakota. It's a beautiful, lush, rolling green prairie. You wouldn't know by looking at it that it's 4 inches away from disaster. When farmers first arrived here around 1900, surveyors found very black topsoil 16 inches deep. Most topsoil only extends to a depth of about 6 inches. But the Great Plains were special. They had an exceptional depth of topsoil, which enabled this area to produce crops and yields beyond the scope of ordinary farmland soil. By 2017, though, the rich, fertile, black topsoils of Divide County were altogether gone. Only 4 inches of light gray soils remain. Divide County is fortunate, though. Researchers believe other parts of North Dakota have easily lost as much as 19 inches of topsoil since 1970 alone. In less than 200 years, since teams of horses and mules began to till up the Midwest, parts of America's flyover states are seeing sand dunes pile up in roadside ditches and begin to bury farm fences. During the Dust Bowl, families like those of Leptis Magna millennia before did what they had to in order to survive. For many, that meant packing up and moving elsewhere, generally west. Today, for the first time in history, simply abandoning our farmland to start again somewhere else isn't an option. The ample, fertile, virgin farmlands of past generations that enable the cycle of land use, exhaustion, and abandonment no longer exist. Most of the Earth's surface isn't well suited for food crops. Mountainous, rocky, and desertified regions aren't farmable. Today, a scant 10% of Earth's farmable land remains uncultivated. Simultaneously, America's prime farmland is rapidly being sealed or capped off for commercial development. Between 1982 and 2007, nearly 35% of prime U.S. farmland was sealed over for urban purposes, and those soils remaining are being increasingly contaminated by heavy metals from air and water pollution that acidify, further desertify, and thus intensify erosion in topsoil. It's a trend other parts of the world have more history with, and globally, the situation is honestly much more dire. While US, European, and South American farm soils are being eroded at rates unrecoverable in our lifetime, some Asian farms are eroding at rates of higher than 30 tons per acre per year. China's Yellow River earned its name by hauling off around 1.6 billion tons of soil every year. Chinese soils aren't just muddying their rivers, they're hanging suspended in the air. The Ganges in India is close. They lose 1.5 billion tons per year. Due to political instability, neither researchers nor the FAO have a clear idea of how much soil sub-Saharan Africa is losing annually. But we do know that productive agricultural fields are fighting a losing battle with encroaching sands from the Sahara, increasingly burying their best soils and fields. Fields generally fail slowly and rarely in unison, but gradual erosion can be the forerunner to sudden, extreme, and apocalyptic type erosion. During the 1930s Dust Bowl, the U.S. Southern Plains lost an average of 60 tons per year per acre, proving that soil erosion can go from bad to biblically catastrophic quickly. Windstorms kicked up plain soils into thick black advancing walls that enveloped and blanketed towns like a death shroud. Blood rain, a mixture of iron-rich ruddy dust and precipitation, poured down from the heavens, turning normally peaceful rivers and lakes deep red. Abrasive gritty winds shredded crop leaves, stalks, and produce alike, and suffocated entire herds of livestock. Suddenly, starved insects and rodents, moving in herds of tens of thousands per acre, invaded cities and towns, panicked and desperate to find food. The Dust Bowl seems like an isolated past tense event, something that could never happen again. But experts believe it will happen again. Without intervention, we should expect similar episodes with increasing frequency over the next 30 years. As our best soils erode first, even before we reach bedrock, eroded soils begin to decline in their capacity to grow crops. Healthy crops need fertile topsoil of at least 6 inches deep. They may survive in areas with less, but they won't thrive. Vast U.S. land areas can no longer support intense cultivation of grain, vegetable, and fiber crops. Former croplands may be used for less demanding commodities, such as grass, hay, and livestock, but simply converting eroded cropland into pasture land doesn't necessarily protect it from further erosion or rebuild the soil. If a drought hits and hungry livestock graze plants too low, already eroded soils can reach a virtual point of no return. Eroded soils can't absorb water like healthy fertile soils do. This increases vulnerability to drought and to the incidence of flash floods. The U.S. government isn't ignorant of these woes. Far from it, every year they pay farmers close to $2 billion to rest their tired fields from production and help protect these lands from further erosion. The U.S. Conservation Reserve Program pays farmers to set aside roughly 20 million acres a year out of America's almost 900 million acres of agricultural land. This is not because only 2% of American farmland is in serious danger from catastrophic erosion. How much the government has to spend and how badly the market needs food determines the amount of land admitted into the program and the length of time the land stays in the program. CRP lands can rest for a maximum of 10 years, but are usually put back into production well before the 10-year mark. This isn't because they've been restored to health, it's because global food demand means even weary, marginally producing lands are worth more in production than being subsidized into rest. Globally, food shortages are about distribution, not lack. In the US alone, 40% of our food is uneaten yearly and finds its way to a landfill. Salvaging even as little as 15% of this would feed up to 25 million more people each year. Extreme weather patterns can cause local shortages, but while poverty exists throughout our world, true famine has been non-existent for centuries. Political strife, internal barriers to foreign aid, and subsequently rising food prices cause most modern food shortages. In the coming 30 years, though, without dramatic intervention on behalf of our soils, genuine lack will become the norm. How close are we now to famine? Every year, the USDA and the FAO, the UN's Agricultural Division, inventory the world's known grain stocks and compare these quantities with the Earth's population. They determine how long the world could survive off of currently existing grains if all food production ceased tomorrow. They focus on staple grains, such as wheat, rice, and soy, due to their caloric density and ability to be transported and stored without refrigeration. In 2022, world grain reserves measured around 70 days. This means that if a global catastrophe hit tomorrow and all existing crops were destroyed, we would have enough food in the global pantry to feed us for about 70 days. The reality behind today's brightly lit and well-stocked grocery aisles is that our world is living off of about a 2-month food supply. This means that in the event of a global catastrophe, farmers would have 70 days to successfully grow and harvest a new crop before the world would begin to starve. Problematically, though, in the event of a global catastrophe or a series of catastrophes, most wheat varieties require 100 to 250 days from the sowing of seed to harvest. Rice crops need 105 to 150 days. Soybeans mature far more quickly at 45 to 65 days, but limited seed reserves and harvesting equipment would be insufficient to make up for the deficit in wheat and rice. The Bible records Libya's neighbor, ancient Egypt, once experiencing a severe famine that lasted 7 years. Wisely, Pharaoh appointed Israel's son, Joseph, to gather and store 20% of their annual harvest for the 7 years before the famine. Egypt's fields were fertile enough to produce 20% more food than the nation's 1 to 2 million Egyptians needed for 7 years prior to the famine. When the withering east winds and undoubtedly severe erosion they brought arrived, Egypt and her neighbors survived because of these grain reserves, perhaps from the lingering remembrance of these events, and perhaps because the majority of their foods today are imported. The Middle East continues to wisely place a priority on grain reserves, and many Middle Eastern countries keep silos filled with a 6-month or greater grain reserve. China and Russia, two of the world's top grain producers, won't divulge grain reserve amounts, but seem certain to have them. The U.S. does not. Today, America has a strategic petroleum reserve, but no grain reserves. The U.S. Grain Reserve Program was discontinued in 1996, and America's last grain reserves left the silos in 2008. In a world where supermarket shelves are restocked daily and mountains of produce are regularly pulled from the shelves to spoil and eaten. A false sense of food security prevails. Modern food production and distribution systems have reduced acquiring food from a sun-up to sundown struggle to a quick stop at the store on a relatively small fraction of our income. Yet most of our lost soils are considered to be irreversible and irrecoverable. Without massive and immediate interventions, our remaining topsoil will be carried off over the next 30 years, or less, as crop yields decline. Washed away down rivers and out to sea, this once bountiful and precious resource at its current unimpeded rate will disappear sometime in the next 30 years. Without dramatic intervention, exhausting and eroding topsoil isn't the ancients' problem anymore. It's our problem. Like the Romans, the sands of time are literally running out for us. Crops will fail, people will starve, and societies will collapse. To survive, we're going to have to unearth what no previous generation has unearthed. We're going to have to get to the root cause of erosion as no previous generation has done. We're going to have to answer the question of why soils erode. That's the end of chapter 1. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, I hope you will like and subscribe to this video and this channel, and that way you will automatically receive notifications when the next chapter comes out. You can also purchase the book on Amazon. Thank you for listening.